Thank you all so much for reading. Whew, and for that music. I'm still feeling it. Thank you so much. 30-ish years before Jesus tells this parable, Mary cradles her belly and sings, "God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." 3 decades later, Jesus looked at a young rich man and said, "How hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven? Indeed, it is easier for the camel to go through the eye of a needle." Jesus, stirred by the song his mother sang as he grew in her womb and the prophets who came before him, talks more about wealth than any other single moral issue. He prioritizes the poor and teaches an upside-down kingdom that will see a reversal of fortune, where the poor are lifted up and the rich are cast down. Luke's gospel in particular reminds us again and again that God's order for the world is not our order. And it's harsh. And it's indicting. This is a hard text. In our story this morning, the rich man ends up in hell, tormented in the flames of Hades. He calls out for a drop of water and is refused. Abraham says to him, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony." There is no reprieve for the rich man in this story. His time for redemption has come and it's gone. So then what? Where is the hope, the message, the call for us here and now in a parable that seems to scream at the top of its lungs, "It's too late"? In my last year of seminary, we all had to write a thesis, and I ended up writing mine on environmental stewardship through the lens of embodied theology. And I wrote about the power of using the metaphor as the earth and everything that dwells within it as God's literal body, and the ways that metaphor can shape how we live on this planet and how we take care of it and how we take care of each other. And so for this thesis, we had different sections that pointed to the various disciplines we studied. So you had to talk about your topic in the context of like church history and theology and practical application. And in every one of these sections, I kept bumping up against this theme, this hypocrisy really, of a religion that at its very core is all about incarnation, and yet has had this historical tradition, this doctrine of distrusting the body, of holding bodies as something lesser than. And I think this bodily distrust comes out in a number of ways, right? It comes out in how we hold our bodies in terms of sex and sexuality, and how we're asked again and again to separate our bodily needs from our spirits and our souls, treating the body as something to be overcome. I know the lion's share of my own religious baggage comes from the ways I was taught to distrust my body, to view it as wrong. I also remember this one time I took a group to camp, and we were working at this like thrift store / food pantry. And the leader of our group had all the campers gathered around talking about the service they provide. And he said, "Well, of course, we require all of the clients to attend a worship service once a week, because in his words, what's the point of feeding those people if they're just going to end up in hell?" So obviously there's a lot to unpack there, right? I can still feel the rage that filled me because he was talking to middle schoolers. I remember being so eager to get them back to camp and debrief because I was afraid that their spongy little minds might start to take this in as truth. This, too, is the kind of hypocritical history of how the body has been treated that I'm talking about. This emphasis, this fight almost to lay claim to the afterlife, not only harms us emotionally and spiritually, right? I'm sure many of you also have the scared into salvation baggage. But it gives an out from looking at the embodied needs of human people here and now, of bearing witness to manifested suffering in this world, of seeing hell on earth and not only doing something about it, but naming our responsibility and helping to create it. In our story, the rich man doesn't see, because he's not even necessarily cruel to Lazarus in the ways we think of cruelty, right? He's not depicted as inherently wicked. He doesn't persecute Lazarus or refuse him food. He doesn't sponsor legislation to rid the gates of poor people. And he doesn't put up benches with spikes to prevent Lazarus from getting some rest. But he doesn't see him. He builds a gate, creates a separation. In this parable, separation is the constant. The gate, one side holding Lazarus, dressed in sores, hungry, disabled, cast out. The other holding the rich man, dressed finely, sitting at a feast. Flash forward, they're both dead, and the gate has become a chasm. But this time, Lazarus is the one comforted, and the man tormented in the flames of Hades. The rich man has carried the separation he created with him. It's part of him, and it's too late. And it's not just too late for him. Lazarus is dead too. He died covered in sores, waiting for scraps, the leftovers that might be cast out. And I know this story and all of the gospel stories preach a beautiful hope. Hope for the marginalized, comfort for the sick, abundance for the poor. God's justice in this and every story is good news. And I do not want to take away from that the balm these stories that condemn the rich might bring to the poor. But the world won't turn on its own. For God's sense of justice to be made manifest, our hands and our feet and our resources must will it to be so. And I don't claim to have a single inkling of what happens beyond our breath and our flesh and our bones. But I do know in this fleshed up life that we live, it is too late for the bodies of millions of people who have died dressed in sores, hungry, cast out. And this parable convicts us to sit in that reality and that grief. Lazarus' comfort by Abraham's side doesn't negate the pain he lived with. But I also don't think Jesus tells this story so we stay there, miserable, hopeless in our grief. I don't think he tells the Pharisees this story just to let them know it's too late. I think he tells it to save them, to save us. I wonder sometimes, as someone whose theology leans away from this notion that I need to be saved in the get into heaven kind of way, what salvation is, what it means. And I think that's a question I'm going to be discerning for the rest of my life. But my working and very personal to me, I'm sure this looks different to all of us, understanding is that salvation is like wholeness. It's like oneness with the Spirit of God, of love. It's connectedness and community with our neighbors. It's connectedness with God's vision for justice. And in the stories we read and tell, Jesus is deeply concerned with our salvation. He doesn't want us to end up in hell like the rich man. And when I say hell, let me be clear that I'm not talking about some place I was taught to fear, a place of brimstone and fire and torment where you go if you tell a lie. I'm talking about hell on earth. And I think there are a number of ways we can talk about hell on earth, right? Surely, hell on earth is brokenness and violence and oppression and poverty. Hell is Lazarus sitting outside a gate, separate, hoping for scraps from the feast. Hell is black and brown and indigenous and poor and queer and disabled and marginalized bodies being pawns in the church of capitalism and in our own quest to lay claim to the afterlife. But that's not the hell on earth I want to focus on right now, because the rich man is in a hell of his own making. And so I wonder then if hell on earth is also us being as far away from salvation as we can get. Perhaps hell on earth is when our souls are damaged because we do the breaking. Hell on earth is our relationship with God stretched because we close our eyes to suffering, because we walk past our gates and do not even dare to see who sits outside of them. Hell is separation and chasm from God, from community, from justice, from each other. Barbara Brown Taylor says about this parable, what they do not seem to know, what we still do not seem to know, is that we are the victims of our own way of life. When we succeed in cutting ourselves off from each other, when we learn how to live with the misery of other people by convincing ourselves that they deserve it, when we defend our own good fortune as God's blessing and decline to see how our lives are quilted together with the lives of others, then we are all losers. Not because of what God will do to us, but because of what we have done to ourselves. Sometimes, she says, I think the worst things we have to fear is that God will give us exactly what we want. The rich man was separated from Lazarus by the gate, by the chasm. This is a story of a separation he created for himself. And this is an unrelenting admonition to the rich to stop building gates, to share wealth and resources, to cease oppression wherever it exists. And it is an indictment to all of us to open our eyes and see what's right in front of us. But this is also a story of salvation. Jesus is not preaching some pie in the sky, by and by theology that seeks to soul save in the next life. He is speaking to real embodied injustices in this life. He is talking to those Pharisees, to us, urgently trying to save us, to save our souls, our minds, our bodies, our connectedness from the hell we create for ourselves before it's too late. And we may have a hard time placing ourselves in this story, because most of us aren't rich, at least by American standards. Globally speaking, we are, at the very least, most of us in like the top 5%. Some of us may identify with Lazarus in part. There are people in our community who face grave injustice and systemic oppression. Maybe we see ourselves as the Pharisees Jesus is talking to. Would we call ourselves money lovers? Maybe we're the brothers, not quite listening to the prophet speaking in our midst. But I'm not even sure this parable is even really about making judgments on who is who. Instead, calling all of us to acknowledge, to truly see the separation in our midst, and to deal with those gates, those chasms that see people dressed in sores on one side and people attending the feast on the other. In this salvation-seeking parable, Jesus calls us to the urgent truth that God's order is not the same as ours. And stories from every faith tradition have said as much, that our world's order of class and caste and high and low contradict the will and nature of God in every way. And Jesus not only cares about our salvation, but he teaches us how to be saved, how to save ourselves. He teaches us again and again and again to care for the outcast, visit the imprisoned, tend to the sick, feed the hungry, prioritize the poor. Jesus identifies with the most vulnerable among us and even says, whenever you tend to them, you tend to me. And in this parable, he also tells us we know everything we need to know to save ourselves. We just don't want to know it. When the rich man begs Abraham to have Lazarus go warn his family, he tells him what might be the hardest truth of this story. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And so I wonder, if we do not listen to the voices in our streets, to the voices of the prophets calling out to us, can even the power of a risen Christ bring us salvation? Mary cradled her belly and said, God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. 3 decades later, Jesus looked at the young rich man and said, how hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven? Indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. He said, blessed are the poor. After that, James said, come now, you rich, and weep and howl for the miseries that are coming to you. Martin Luther called the church to rid itself of practices that saved salvation for the wealthy. Saints and activists and leaders and people whose names we will never know have continued to echo these calls. Our prophets are still speaking.
Countries with advanced economies, inequality of income and wealth has surged, and nowhere has it surged more than in the U.S., where reliance on free market forces has been strongest. That magnifies rewards for those at the top and leaves most others behind.
There's a new black man in America today.
The gap between rich and poor in this country is wide, and it's getting wider.
When politicians say that your voice doesn't matter because the NRA owns them, we say no more. When politicians send their thoughts and prayers with no action, we say no more.
People are suffering. People are dying. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
Greta is amazing, but white, cis, settler voices are centered whenever we have conversation about climate change. When we think of land, we don't think of it as a commodity. The reason why climate change exists is because colonialism and capitalism go hand in hand. But when you think of the land as a commodity, as something that can be bought, as something that isn't sacred, this leads to rising CO2 emissions.
New York was hit hardest by the pandemic and the poorest worst affected.
In 24 months since the pandemic struck in 2020, the wealth of the world's billionaires increased more than the combined growth of nearly 2 preceding years. The 3 sectors in which the world faces crisis have recorded the maximum profits in their lifetimes.
Concentration of wealth in the hands of the few isn't going away. Yes, the nuances might be changing, the figure may be changing, but fundamentally the reality is that the concentration of wealth is unconscionably extremely high, which should not be the case.
Let me explain to you something about economics in America, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct?
High food prices, health cost, loss of livelihood, and the overall dip in earnings will push at least 263 million into poverty in 2022. That is at a rate of 1 million people every 33 hours.
And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true.
Our prophets are still speaking. There is no way to change the ending of this story. The rich man is in hell. His time for redemption has come and gone. And so we sit with the harsh reality and the grief of the people who have died dressed in sores, hungry, cast out, and the even harder reality of how we might be complicit. But as long as we have breath in our lungs, it is not too late. The clients of the food pantry and thrift store that day I was at with my middle schoolers are not the ones who needed church, who needed saving. And I would flip that leader's question on its head. If we are not caring for our community, feeding the hungry, seeking abundance for the poor, then what's the point? The good news is the Spirit of the God of love, of justice, dwells within and among us. The prophets are calling out in the streets and in our midst. They're carrying soil to the roof and cans to the dungeon. It is not too late for us to kick down the gates, open our eyes, save ourselves, and seek wholeness for our communities and our world. It is not too late to listen to the voices of the prophets, and it is not too late to hear prophecy coming from our own mouths. It is not too late to live out God's news of justice, the good news of justice, right here and right now. May it be so for me and for you.